What if the most painful connection you ever experienced was never punishment, but a mirror your unconscious mind refused to look into? Because the person who drained your emotional world was not the final destination. They were the pattern interruption your psyche needed before real love could enter. If this resonates with you, stay with this message until the end, because what comes next will show you how these cycles actually break, and why most people never escape them. Early emotional intensity in relationships is often mistaken for destiny, but in psychological reality, it usually reveals the activation of unconscious attachment patterns formed long before the current connection. When someone suddenly feels a powerful pull, a sense of familiarity, urgency, or emotional rightness, it is rarely about true compatibility at the surface level. Instead, the nervous system is recognizing a feeling state it has already experienced in earlier life. If a person grew up in environments where love was inconsistent, emotionally charged, or unpredictable, the body learns to associate intensity with connection and stability with emotional distance. So when a similar emotional pattern appears later in life, it feels deeply meaningful, even when it is simply repetition. In these moments, projection becomes central. The mind begins to place unspoken needs, unresolved emotions, and unmet expectations onto the other person. They are no longer seen clearly, but symbolically, as if they hold the key to emotional resolution. This is especially strong in individuals who are highly empathetic, because they often interpret emotional intensity as a sign of depth or spiritual significance. The connection feels like it is meant to heal something, but what is actually happening is the unconscious trying to complete an unfinished emotional story through a new person. As the relationship develops, intermittent emotional reinforcement often strengthens the bond. Moments of closeness, affection, or validation are followed by distance, confusion, or withdrawal. This unpredictable rhythm creates a powerful neurological loop that deepens attachment through uncertainty. The mind becomes focused on restoring the good moments, even if the overall experience is draining. Because the nervous system prioritizes familiarity over well-being, it continues to interpret emotional volatility as meaningful connection rather than imbalance. Over time, this creates the illusion that intensity equals love. The emotional highs feel like proof of importance, while the lows are rationalized as challenges that must be endured. The person begins to invest more deeply, not because the relationship is healthy, but because the emotional activation keeps reinforcing the belief that something significant is unfolding. In reality, it is often the repetition of an earlier relational template seeking resolution, not a new and stable bond forming in the present. When this pattern is finally seen without emotional distortion, something important shifts. The mind begins to separate familiarity from truth and intensity from compatibility. What once felt like fate starts to reveal itself as repetition, and in that clarity, the possibility for healthier, more balanced connection finally emerges. Empaths tend to overgive in relationships not because they lack awareness or strength, but because giving becomes an unconscious strategy for maintaining emotional safety and connection. On a deeper psychological level, overgiving is often rooted in early relational conditioning where love was perceived as something that had to be earned through emotional labor, attentiveness, or self-sacrifice. When affection in formative environments was inconsistent, the mind learns to stabilize uncertainty by becoming useful, accommodating, or emotionally attuned to others at the expense of the self. This creates a pattern where self-worth becomes externally referenced, and emotional harmony is maintained by anticipating the needs of others before expressing one's own. When this pattern carries into adult relationships, the empath naturally gravitates toward roles where they can feel needed. Overgiving then becomes a form of identity reinforcement, because it creates a temporary sense of purpose and emotional significance. However, this dynamic unintentionally attracts emotionally unavailable personalities. These individuals often carry their own unresolved relational patterns, including difficulty with intimacy, avoidance of vulnerability, or a need for control through emotional distance. What makes this pairing so persistent is the complementary nature of the imbalance. One person overextends to maintain closeness, while the other withdraws to maintain autonomy, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. In this exchange, the empath's generosity is not always received as intended. Instead of deepening mutual connection, it can sometimes remove the necessity for the other person to engage emotionally, to reciprocate, or to develop relational responsibility. The more the empath gives, the more space is unintentionally created for emotional withdrawal on the other side. This is not due to fault or intention, but due to unconscious compatibility between two opposing coping mechanisms. Over time, the empath may begin to feel exhausted, confused, or emotionally depleted, while simultaneously feeling responsible for sustaining the relationship. This is where the cycle becomes most binding, because overgiving is now tied not only to love, but also to fear of loss. The nervous system begins to interpret withdrawal from giving as abandonment risk, reinforcing the behavior even further. What feels like devotion is often a deeply ingrained emotional survival strategy. When observed clearly, this pattern reveals that overgiving is not the expression of abundance alone, but also a subtle attempt to secure connection in environments that do not naturally sustain it. And this is precisely what continues the cycle until awareness interrupts it. Narcissistic dynamics often emerge in relationships not as isolated personality clashes, but as psychological projections shaped by unmet emotional needs on both sides. At the core of this interaction is a symbolic exchange rather than a fully conscious relationship. The empath, carrying a deep sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, often projects meaning, potential, and emotional depth onto the other person, especially in the early stages when intensity is mistaken for authenticity. The emotionally self-focused individual, on the other hand, may project confidence, certainty, or emotional authority that fills a perceived internal void within the empath's sense of direction or self-definition. What develops is not simply attraction, but mutual projection that temporarily stabilizes internal psychological gaps. From a Jungian perspective, the other person becomes an unconscious screen for disowned aspects of the self. The empath may carry an unintegrated need for boundaries, assertiveness, or self-prioritization, while the narcissistic pattern may reflect a disowned vulnerability or emotional dependency that has been suppressed. Instead of recognizing these traits internally, each person encounters them externally through the other, which creates both fascination and friction. The relationship feels compelling because it activates psychological material that has not yet been integrated into conscious awareness. This dynamic intensifies because projection prevents clear perception. The empath does not fully see the other person as they are, but as they are needed to be for emotional meaning to form. Likewise, the emotionally self-focused individual does not engage with the empath's inner world, but with the emotional response they receive from them. This creates a loop where each person interacts more with their internal projections than with the actual reality of the other. Over time, this imbalance becomes unsustainable. As projection weakens through lived experience, contradictions begin to surface. The empath starts to notice emotional inconsistency, lack of reciprocity, or depletion, while the other person may experience pressure from emotional expectations they did not consciously agree to meet. What once felt magnetic begins to feel confusing or destabilizing. The deeper function of this dynamic is not simply relational failure, but psychological exposure. It forces the empath to confront where meaning was being placed outside the self, and where emotional validation was being sought through external reflection. When projection dissolves, the relationship loses its inflated significance, revealing a more ordinary and often incompatible reality beneath the psychological overlay. The push and pull dynamic in relationships is often misunderstood as emotional chemistry or spiritual connection, but in psychological terms, it is more accurately a nervous system response shaped by early conditioning. It develops when a person's internal sense of safety is linked to inconsistency, where emotional availability was unpredictable in formative relationships. In such environments, closeness and distance become intertwined signals, so the body learns to associate uncertainty with attachment rather than stability. This conditioning later reappears in adult relationships, where emotional inconsistency feels strangely familiar rather than clearly distressing. When one partner moves closer emotionally and then suddenly withdraws, the other partner's nervous system reacts as if something essential has been lost. This triggers anxiety, longing, and heightened focus on restoring connection. When closeness returns, relief and emotional reward are experienced, reinforcing the bond. This cycle creates a biochemical pattern of attachment driven by dopamine spikes linked to uncertainty rather than consistent affection. The mind begins to chase resolution rather than experiencing peace, because resolution has been intermittently rewarded in the past. What makes this dynamic particularly powerful is that it mimics emotional depth. The highs feel profound, almost transformative, while the lows feel meaningful and necessary, as if growth is happening through struggle. However, what is actually occurring is emotional dysregulation being mistaken for intimacy. The system becomes conditioned to interpret activation as connection, even when the overall experience is destabilizing. Over time, this pattern can override internal signals of incompatibility. Even when one part of the psyche recognizes imbalance, the nervous system continues to respond to the familiar cycle of separation and reunion. This creates internal conflict between awareness and attachment, where insight does not immediately translate into behavioral change. The person may intellectually understand the dynamic, yet still feel pulled back into it emotionally. The push and pull dynamic persists until the nervous system no longer interprets inconsistency as attachment. When emotional regulation begins to develop internally rather than being outsourced to another person's behavior, the cycle starts to lose its grip. What once felt like intensity gradually reveals itself as instability, and what once felt like love begins to be recognized as a conditioned response to unpredictability rather than a reflection of genuine relational security. Repetition of painful relationship patterns is often not a sign of fate or punishment, but a reflection of unresolved childhood relational templates stored in the emotional memory of the nervous system. In early development, the mind does not simply learn facts about relationships. It learns emotional expectations about how love behaves, how safety feels, and what must be done to maintain connection. If those early experiences involved emotional inconsistency, criticism, absence, or conditional affection, the psyche adapts by forming internal models that normalize instability as part of attachment. These internal templates operate largely outside conscious awareness. So when a similar emotional environment appears in adulthood, the system recognizes it as familiar, even if it is harmful. Familiarity has a powerful influence on human behavior because the brain prioritizes what is known over what is healthy. This is why a person may repeatedly find themselves in relationships that feel emotionally intense but ultimately unfulfilling or destabilizing. The unconscious is not seeking suffering. It is seeking resolution of an unresolved pattern. Each new relationship becomes an attempt to rewrite an earlier emotional outcome. The psyche returns to similar dynamics, hoping that with a different person, a different result can finally be achieved. However, because the underlying template remains unchanged, the external circumstances tend to recreate similar emotional arcs. This is why patterns repeat even when conscious intentions change. The deeper programming has not yet been updated through awareness and emotional integration. In these cycles, there is often a strong internal conflict between what is consciously desired and what is emotionally familiar. A person may genuinely want stability, respect, and reciprocity, yet still feel drawn toward intensity, unpredictability, or emotional unavailability. This pull is not logical, it is conditioned. The nervous system confuses activation with connection and discomfort with meaning, especially when those states were once part of early bonding experiences. Repetition continues until the pattern becomes visible at both cognitive and emotional levels. Intellectual understanding alone is not enough, because the body continues to respond to old cues even after the mind has recognized them. Change begins when awareness is paired with new emotional experiences that slowly recondition the nervous system to tolerate and eventually prefer stability. When this shift happens, repetition loses its unconscious force. The person no longer feels compelled to recreate familiar pain in new forms, and the search for resolution outside the self begins to dissolve. The idea that the psyche seeks familiarity over well-being explains why people can remain in emotionally harmful relationships even when logic clearly signals distress. The nervous system is not primarily designed to maximize happiness. It is designed to maximize predictability. Predictability creates a sense of survival safety, even if the experience itself is emotionally painful. This is why familiar emotional patterns, even dysfunctional ones, often feel more tolerable than unfamiliar stability at first. When someone has grown up in environments where emotional connection was inconsistent, unpredictable, or conditional, their internal system adapts by treating instability as normal. In such cases, calmness or emotional steadiness may initially feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. The absence of emotional highs and lows can be interpreted as distance or lack of interest, because the nervous system has been trained to associate intensity with connection. This creates a paradox where healthier dynamics feel less emotionally real than chaotic ones. This preference for familiarity also influences how emotional bonds are formed and maintained. The psyche often chooses relationships that replicate earlier emotional climates because they provide a known framework for interaction. Even if those frameworks lead to pain, they reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is perceived as a deeper threat than discomfort. As a result, individuals may unconsciously gravitate toward relational dynamics that mirror their earliest emotional imprints, even when consciously seeking something different. Over time, this mechanism reinforces cycles of repetition. Each time a familiar but unhealthy pattern is experienced, it strengthens the internal belief that this is simply how relationships function. This is not because the individual lacks insight, but because emotional learning operates beneath conscious reasoning. The body remembers what the mind tries to move beyond, and it responds automatically to cues that resemble past experiences. Breaking this cycle requires more than intellectual understanding. It involves gradually reconditioning the nervous system to recognize that stability does not equal absence of love, and that consistency can be safe rather than empty. This process often feels uncomfortable at first because it removes the emotional intensity that was previously mistaken for connection. However, with time, the system begins to recalibrate. When well-being slowly becomes more familiar than chaos, the preference for instability weakens. The psyche no longer defaults to what it recognizes from the past, but begins to respond to what actually supports emotional balance in the present. The emergence of growth through awareness rather than repetition marks a fundamental shift in how relationships are experienced at a psychological level. In earlier stages of emotional development, patterns tend to repeat automatically because they are driven by unconscious conditioning. The individual is not choosing the pattern in a fully conscious way. They are being guided by emotional memory, attachment wiring, and unresolved internal conflicts. In this phase, life feels like a series of similar emotional experiences with different faces, as if the same story is being rewritten but never fully resolved. Awareness interrupts this automatic cycle. It introduces a space between emotional impulse and behavioral response, where observation becomes possible without immediate identification. Instead of being fully absorbed in intensity, confusion, or attachment, the individual begins to notice the pattern while it is happening. This shift may seem subtle at first, but it is structurally significant because it weakens the unconscious authority of repetition. As awareness deepens, the meaning of relationships begins to change. Painful dynamics are no longer interpreted as destiny or emotional necessity, but as signals pointing toward unresolved inner structures. This does not immediately eliminate attachment, but it changes the way attachment is understood. The focus shifts from, "Why is this happening to me?" to, "What is being activated within me?" This internal reorientation reduces projection and increases responsibility for emotional experience. Growth in this stage is not about avoiding all difficult relationships, but about no longer being unconsciously governed by them. The same emotional triggers may still appear, but they no longer automatically dictate choices or interpretations. There is a gradual strengthening of internal stability, where emotional regulation is no longer outsourced to external validation or relational unpredictability. Over time, awareness begins to restructure the nervous system itself. What once created urgency and fixation begins to lose its intensity. Emotional patterns that previously felt overwhelming become recognizable and therefore less compelling. This is where repetition breaks, not through force, but through clarity. In this state, relationships are no longer primarily vehicles for unconscious healing through pain, but spaces where conscious choice becomes possible. The individual begins to recognize that growth is not found in repeating old emotional loops, but in seeing them clearly enough that they no longer need to be repeated. The final shift happens when the psyche no longer uses repetition as its primary method of learning, and instead begins to integrate experience into conscious understanding. At this stage, the individual starts to recognize that attraction, intensity, and emotional urgency are not reliable indicators of compatibility, but signals that can either reflect genuine connection or activate old emotional imprints. This distinction becomes crucial because it allows relationships to be evaluated not only through feeling, but through awareness of what is being internally triggered. When unresolved patterns lose their unconscious control, the inner world becomes less reactive. Emotional responses still occur, but they are no longer automatically interpreted as truth or destiny. Instead, they are seen as information. This creates a more stable internal foundation, where the individual is no longer pulled into cycles of over-identification with others. The need to resolve past emotional wounds through external relationships gradually weakens, because those wounds are now being understood and integrated internally. In this state, relationships begin to feel fundamentally different. There is less urgency, less emotional confusion, and less dependency on highs and lows to create a sense of connection. Instead, clarity, consistency, and mutual presence become more recognizable as indicators of genuine bonding. What once felt too calm may now be understood as emotionally secure rather than lacking depth. This transformation also changes the way endings and detachment are experienced. Previously, loss may have felt like collapse or abandonment of identity. Now it becomes an adjustment rather than a rupture of self. The emotional system no longer equates separation with existential threat, because self-regulation is no longer dependent on another person's behavior.
Ultimately, the resolution of these patterns does not lead to the absence of attraction or emotion, but to a more conscious relationship with them. Emotional intensity is no longer the guiding force. It becomes one of many signals rather than the dominant one. The individual is able to choose relationships based on alignment rather than compulsion, presence rather than projection, and clarity rather than unconscious repetition. At this point, the earlier cycles lose their necessity. What once appeared as fate revealing itself through pain is now understood as the psyche learning through repetition until awareness made repetition unnecessary.